Well, let's talk about the tax laws that is now in full effect on the first day of January. I'm joined by Oladejo Adeyemi, who's a partner at Anderson, Nigeria, to help us understand some of the gray areas. Mr. Adeyemi, thank you for joining us on TVC News at 10. There's been widespread confusion online about particularly the new 800,000 Naira zero tax threshold. Some reports suggest it applies only to the first year of the law. We're also hearing others say it protects low-income earners indefinitely. What's your understanding of how this threshold works? Who exactly qualifies? And are minimum wage earners in higher paying states affected?
Okay, thanks so much for having me. This is this is an interesting time in the history of our country. And like you've mentioned, there have been a lot of misconceptions, around a couple of provisions that we've had in the new tax law. Specific to your question with respect to the 800,000, the intent of the law with respect to the 800,000 is to ensure that the poorest of the poor among us are not overly burdened again with the issue of taxation. So what that provision does is recognizing that if all you've earned is 800,000 for an entire year, you've not earned above 800,000 for an entire year, then the tax rate applicable to you on the first rung of that ladder is going to be 0%, which means you should not bother yourself with the issue of taxation if all you've earned in a year is 800,000 Naira, not for 1 month, not for 2 months, but for an entire year.
Absolutely. It means, therefore, that certain minimum wage earners who earn more than that as we speak are now captured within the tax bracket. But the law also introduces various exemptions. There are reported reliefs and deductions. But online discussions often mistake what's really covered. What are the key exemptions for both employees and self-employed in this regard?
Interesting. The issue of the 800,000 exemption is where I'm going to be starting from. It is interesting to know that even those that earn above 800,000, that particular threshold in their income is first taxed at 0%, because if you are familiar with the graduated scale, the scale, proceeds from first 800,000. So indeed, for everyone, even if you earn 50 million, the first 800,000 of your taxable income, is actually going to be at 0%. So that is the first exemption that applies to apply essentially to everyone. The next is then the issue of rent relief. The old law recognized consolidated relief allowance. But in place of that consolidated relief allowance, there is a very prominent relief that has now been recognized to say that if you are paying rent, you can claim up to 20% of your rental income, or 500,000, whichever is lower. The amount should not be more than 500,000 that you can claim. That is also a very laudable initiative to say that if you are paying rent, you are a rent-paying taxpayer, you can claim up to 500,000 of your rental expense, as tax relief. And there are a couple more other exemptions that have been recognized. When you go to the value-added tax, for instance, you would see exemption with respect to household items, basic food items, and all of that, duly exempted from the provisions of the value-added tax, in itself, so that households can feel the relief and the impact can be duly cushioned, in terms of the current economic realities.
We'll talk about VAT if you have the time in this conversation. But with the rollout of the new e-tax processes, Nigerians are worried about penalties for late filing or mistakes. How does the law handle compliance enforcement, and how do you think government can really ensure that this system is accessible and fair for ordinary taxpayers?
Okay, so the issue of penalties are not new to us. The issues bordering on penalty have always been there. We've always had penalty even in the old law. What has happened now is the penalties have been stiffer, I should say, But with respect to filing, the act that controls that or that regulate that is the Nigeria Tax Administration Act, which specifies that you need to register, you need to file at prescribed period and all of that. So I think the reason that the government delayed the implementation of this is to, if you recall, these Reforms Acts were signed into law, into an act of the parliament since 26th of June 2025. So the government has essentially given this window period, and also ensured extensive engagement with different stakeholders to be sure that everyone understood what their responsibility would be. So with that intense level of engagement, it is expected that taxpayers are already familiar with what is required of them, to a very large extent. Nonetheless, recall that the presidency also set up a different committee, quite recently on implementation. That committee is headed by Joseph Tegbe, and is also working hand in hand with the committee that bathed the laws, in themselves. So it's definitely expected that there would be a lot of clarity, there will be a lot of guidelines, that will still be issued, with respect to any timeline that the law has provided for, but has not been specified, in the act, which will definitely cover the issue of filing.
You talked about indirect taxes like VAT earlier. There are also other levies that we've seen that have seen some changes under this new law. We're getting feelers that many citizens remain unclear about which goods and services are going to be affected and how this will really impact their daily expenses.
Okay, so if you have followed the conversation, for many Nigerians that have followed the conversation over the period, you would recall that when these old acts and the reforms were still in the works, the issue of value-added tax created a lot of contention. Because there was an attempt to increase the rates, and the Governors Forum, weighed in to say, do not make Nigerians bear the brunt, and all of that. So what has happened with respect to VAT is really been interesting. There have been some rework in terms of how the value-added tax in itself is shared between federal government and the state government and the local government, and then some principles have also been upheld in terms of consumption principle, the principle of population, to see what will be shared even among the other tiers of government, particularly the state government and the local government. What will the basis of that sharing be? Those things have now been specified in the tax law, But with respect to household, I think this is generally a good thing. What the law has done now is generally a good thing for many Nigerians, because goods that we didn't used to have clarity on in terms of the applicability of VAT before. There've been a lot of contentious issue, bottled water, value has been added, value has not been added. All of those things have now been clarified, to say that these goods will not be applicable to VAT. So generally a lot of household items, a lot of basic food items, tuition, and a couple more things that we now have that explicit clarity on with respect to the applicability of VAT.
It's a developing story, and many Nigerians are very interested, especially as we enter 2026. So we're probably going to continue this conversation subsequently. Oladejo Adeyemi, partner at Anderson, Nigeria. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.